Quen 3 Max 109. PMI in the hush of early morning, when the Georgia sky was still painted in soft grays and the air smelled like damp earth and pine, a man walked barefoot through his fields. Dew clung to his jeans, and the red clay, rich, stubborn, and ancient, stuck to his soles like it always had. This land wasn't just dirt to him. It was memory. It was defiance. It was home. His family had held on to these 320 acres longer than most thought possible. Back in 1921, his great-grandfather, a man who'd never learned to read but knew the weight of a promise, bought the first 10 acres, with money saved from selling sweet potatoes and mending fences for white landowners who'd never look him in the eye. That purchase wasn't just a transaction. It was an act of quiet rebellion. In those days, black folks owning land in the South wasn't just rare. It was dangerous. Banks wouldn't lend, neighbors whispered. Laws twisted to make it hard. But somehow, through droughts, floods, and threats both spoken and silent, the land stayed in the family. Now, more than a century later, the man walking those rows carried that legacy in his shoulders. He'd grown up watching his father rise before sunrise, not because he had to, but because the land demanded respect. By the time he was 10, he could fix a tractor carburetor. By 16, he was managing crop rotation schedules. And by 30, he'd done something no one in his family had ever imagined. He'd turned the farm into a business that didn't just survive. It thrived. He wasn't flashy about it. There were no billboards or social media posts, no interviews with glossy magazines. He preferred worn boots to designer shoes and a quiet handshake to a loud pitch. But behind the scenes, he'd done the work. He studied soil science online after dinner. He installed solar-powered irrigation systems. He partnered with local food co-ops to sell non-GMO peanuts and organic cotton. Slowly, steadily, he built something real, not just profitable but sustainable. By his mid-40s, the debts were gone. The equipment was paid for. And for the first time in generations, there was something left over at the end of the year, enough to dream a little. But success in rural America doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with sideways glances, like the time he walked into the feed store in town and the clerk accidentally rang up his purchase twice, assuming he wouldn't notice. Or when he stopped for gas after a long haul and 2 state troopers pulled in behind him, lights off, just watching as he paid. He'd learned to move through the world with a kind of careful calm, polite but never too friendly, confident but never loud. It wasn't fear. It was strategy, a survival rhythm passed down through blood and bone. Still, he refused to let bitterness take root. He'd seen what it did to good men, how it twisted their joy into something sharp and lonely. Instead, he poured his energy into the land, into his crew, most of whom had worked with his father or even his grandfather, into the community garden he helped fund at the edge of town, where kids learned to grow collards and tomatoes instead of scrolling on phones all day. He believed in showing up, doing the work, and letting results speak louder than words. Then came the season that changed everything. It started with a brutal summer, heat so thick it felt like breathing soup, and rain that refused to fall for 63 days straight. Crops withered. Wells ran low. Insurance adjusters showed up with clipboards and skeptical frowns. Most farmers in the county filed for emergency aid or sold off parcels just to stay afloat. But he held on. He tapped into reserves he'd quietly built over years. He rerouted water from a deeper aquifer. He even rented out his extra storage barns to neighboring farms who'd lost theirs to storm damage. By harvest time, against all odds, his yields were down but not gone. And when the final numbers came in, he realized something astonishing. He'd not only survived the worst drought in 2 decades, he'd come out ahead. That night, sitting on his porch with a cold glass of sweet tea and the crickets singing in the tall grass, he let himself feel it. The quiet pride, the exhaustion, the strange lightness of knowing he'd done right by the land and the legacy. And in that stillness, an idea took shape. Not a wild fantasy, but a practical one. A private jet. It wasn't about luxury. Truth was, he hated flying commercial. The lines, the delays, the way his boots got side-eyed in first class even when he paid full fare. More than that, time was slipping through his fingers. Between supplier meetings in Texas, seed conferences in Iowa, and sustainability summits in California, he was spending nearly a week each month just getting from place to place. A small jet, something efficient, reliable, would give him back those hours. He could leave after morning chores, land by lunch, be back home before dark. It made sense. Not as a symbol, but as a tool, like a better plow or a smarter irrigation system. He didn't tell anyone at first. Not his foreman, not his sister who ran the farm's books, not even his oldest friend who'd known him since they were kids stealing watermelons from Mr. Henderson's patch. He just started researching, late nights at the kitchen table, laptop glowing, comparing models, reading pilot reviews, calculating fuel costs and maintenance schedules. He narrowed it down to a pre-owned Cessna Citation CJ3, room for 6, range of over 1,800 miles, known for reliability. Perfect for his needs, and within his means, thanks to years of careful saving and smart reinvestment. When he finally called a broker in Florida, his voice was steady, but his hands weren't. This was new territory. Not just financially, but emotionally. Buying a jet wasn't something folks from his world did. It felt like stepping onto a stage where he wasn't invited. But he reminded himself this wasn't about fitting in. It was about function, about efficiency, about claiming the same practical freedoms others took for granted. He booked a flight down to see the aircraft in person. Packed a small duffel, clean khakis, a pressed button-down shirt, his best work boots, polished but still boots. He didn't wear a suit, didn't see the point. He was a farmer. That's who he was. And if they couldn't sell a plane to a farmer, then maybe they didn't deserve his business. As the regional jet touched down in Fort Lauderdale, he looked out the window at the rows of gleaming private aircraft parked near the terminal. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Men in sunglasses and tailored jackets strode across tarmacs like they owned the sky. He took a deep breath, adjusted his collar, and stepped onto the tarmac. Not as an intruder, but as someone who'd earned his place, 1 acre, 1 season, 1 hard decision at a time. What happened next would shake him in ways droughts and debt never could. But that's another part of the story for now. It was enough to know this. A black man from rural Georgia, whose ancestors were told they'd never own anything of value, was walking into a world that rarely saw people like him as anything but a surprise, and he was ready to buy a piece of the sky. The dealership sat just off the main runway at a private airfield outside Fort Lauderdale, all glass and steel and gleaming white surfaces that reflected the Florida sun like mirrors. Palm trees swayed in the breeze, and the low hum of distant jet engines filled the air, a sound that to most visitors meant wealth, freedom, speed. To him, it just meant business. He walked in wearing the same clothes he'd packed, clean khakis, a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his boots, still dusty from the Georgia red clay, though he'd wiped them twice before stepping inside. The receptionist glanced up, then quickly looked back down at her screen. A man in a navy blazer approached, smile tight, eyes flicking over him like he was reading a warning label. "Can I help you?" the man asked, voice polite but edged with something unspoken. "I'm here to look at the CJ3, he said, calm, direct. "We spoke on the phone last week, Booker." The man blinked. "Ah, right." He extended a hand, then pulled it back slightly as if remembering something. "Let me get Chad. He's handling that listing." Chad turned out to be younger, slicked back hair, crisp white shirt, gold watch that probably cost more than a year's worth of seed. He greeted him with a handshake that lasted half a second too short, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So you're interested in the citation?" Chad said, leading him toward the hangar where the jet sat, polished and silent under the morning light. "I'm not just interested," he replied. "I'm ready to buy cash." Chad stopped walking, turned slowly. "Cash?" "Yes." There was a pause, just a beat, but it stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight. Then Chad laughed a little too loudly. "Wow, that's rare. Most buyers finance, even the ones who can pay outright. Just for the liquidity, you know?" He nodded. He did know. But he also knew that when you come from a place where banks once refused your grandfather a loan for a mule, you learn to keep your money close and your promises closer. They walked the rest of the way in silence. Inside the hangar, the jet looked even better than in the photos. Sleek, silver, with dark-tinted windows and a cabin that smelled faintly of leather and disinfectant. He ran a hand along the fuselage, not with awe, but with the quiet focus of someone inspecting a tractor before purchase. "Mind if I look inside?" he asked. "Be my guest," Chad said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He stepped up the stairs, ducked through the doorway, and took it all in. The plush seats, the touchscreen controls, the mini galley. Everything was in excellent condition. He'd done his homework. This wasn't his first rodeo with big purchases. Years ago, he'd bought a combine harvester for over $500,000 after just 2 site visits. This felt no different except for the way Chad hovered near the door, arms crossed like he expected him to try to steal the ashtray. Back outside, Chad cleared his throat. "So, you said cash. Do you have proof of funds?" "Just standard procedure." "Of course," he said, pulling out his phone. "My banker can send verification directly to your office, or I can authorize a wire confirmation right now." Chad hesitated. "Actually, we usually require more than that for transactions this size. Especially with first-time buyers." He raised an eyebrow. "First-time jet buyer, maybe. But I've bought land, equipment, storage facilities, all in the 7 figures. Never had an issue." Chad shifted his weight. "This is a different industry. High-value asset. International regulations. You understand?" He did understand. But he also understood the difference between caution and condescension, and this felt like the latter wrapped in paperwork. Over the next few hours, the questions kept coming, not about the plane's maintenance logs or avionics upgrades, which he'd already reviewed, but about him. Where exactly did he farm? How long had he owned the land? Could he provide tax returns? A letter from his accountant? Proof of land deeds going back to original purchase? "No one's ever asked me for my great-grandfather's deed," he said quietly, more to himself than to Chad. Chad shrugged. "Just covering our bases." Later, as he sat in the dealership's client lounge, a room with leather couches and bottled water that tasted faintly of plastic, he overheard 2 salesmen talking near the coffee machine. "Said he's a farmer," one muttered. "From Georgia. Came in boots." "Yeah, and claims he's buying outright." "Right," the other chuckled. "Probably thinks a jet's like a pickup truck." He didn't react. Didn't stand up. Just sipped his water and stared out the window at the tarmac, where a white Gulfstream taxied past, its owner stepping out in loafers and linen pants, greeted by a team with umbrellas and smiles. That night, back at his modest hotel near the airport, he called his accountant, a woman who'd worked with his family for 20 years. She was furious when he told her what happened. "They're treating you like you're trying to scam them," she said. "I've sent verification to private jet brokers before, for clients who inherited oil money or sold tech startups. Never once asked for 5 years of bank statements." He lay back on the bed staring at the ceiling. It wasn't just about the jet anymore. It was about being seen. Really seen. Not as a stereotype, not as an anomaly, but as a man who'd worked hard, played by the rules, and earned his place just like anyone else. The next morning, he returned to the dealership, this time with a printed portfolio. Land titles, recent bank confirmations, letters from co-op partners, even a feature article a regional farming journal had done on his sustainable practices. He laid it all on Chad's desk without a word. Chad flipped through it slowly, face unreadable. Finally, he said, "Impressive. But we still need to run internal compliance checks." "Could take a few days, that's fine," he said. "But I'll be looking at other options too." It was the first time he saw a flicker of concern in Chad's eyes. Later that afternoon, while waiting for a test flight that had been rescheduled, he struck up a conversation with a mechanic refueling a nearby turboprop. The man was older, hands stained with oil, name tag reading D. Ruiz. "You here to buy that CJ3? Ruiz asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Trying to," he said. Ruiz nodded slowly. "Heard how they've been treating you." "Not right. You work here?" "Contractor. Been in this business 30 years. Seen a lot." He lowered his voice. "Last year, a Nigerian businessman came in, bought 2 jets, no questions. Paid in crypto even. They rolled out the red carpet." He didn't respond, but the words settled deep. That evening, as he walked back to his car, a woman in a pilot's uniform passed by, pulling a roller bag. She glanced at him, then did a double take. "Hey," she said, "aren't you the guy from the Georgia farm? I read that piece about your regenerative cotton project." He was stunned. "You did?" "I'm with a cargo startup. We're looking for sustainable suppliers. Mind if I get your card?" For the first time in 2 days, he felt like himself again. Not a curiosity, not a threat, just a professional among professionals. He gave her his card. As he drove away from the airfield, the sun setting in streaks of orange and purple, he made a decision. If this dealership couldn't see past his boots, then maybe he didn't want their jet anyway. There were other skies, other sellers, other ways to fly, but the sting remained. Not because they doubted his money, but because they doubted his right to be there at all. And that was a kind of humiliation no amount of cash could erase, not yet. The test flight was supposed to be the turning point, the moment everything shifted from suspicion to respect. He'd arranged it through a different broker, one recommended by a pilot he'd met at an agri-tech conference years ago. This new broker didn't ask for his life story, didn't flinch when he said farmer, just sent over the aircraft logbooks, confirmed availability, and scheduled a demo flight with a certified pilot. Simple, professional, normal. He arrived at the airfield early, the Georgia sun still low, casting long shadows over the tarmac. The jet sat ready, engines cold but gleaming under the morning light. The pilot, a quiet man in his 50s with a weathered face and calm eyes, greeted him with a firm handshake and a nod. No questions, no hesitation, just ready when you are. As they taxied down the runway, the hum of the engines rising into a steady roar, he felt something loosen in his chest. This was it. Not the luxury, not the status, the freedom. The ability to move through the world on his own terms, without waiting for delayed flights or explaining why a man who grows peanuts might also need to be in California by noon. They climbed to 25,000 feet. Below, the patchwork of suburbs and wetlands blurred into a watercolor of greens and blues. He leaned back, watching the horizon stretch endlessly. For the first time in days, he breathed easy. Then his phone buzzed. It was a call from the original dealership, the one with Chad and the glass walls and the sideways glances. He almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of him. "Mr. Booker?" It was Chad's voice, tighter than usual. "We've had some concerns come up during our internal review." "Concerns about what?" he asked, keeping his tone even. "About the legitimacy of the transaction. We're not sure this purchase aligns with our compliance protocols." He sat up straighter. "Legitimacy? I've provided bank verification, land titles, tax records. What more do you need?" There was a pause. Then carefully, "It's not just about the documents. It's the context. A private jet is a major asset. We have to be certain the buyer understands the responsibilities and that the funds are truly theirs." The words landed like stones. He looked out the window at the endless sky, suddenly feeling very small. "You're saying you don't believe I earned this?" he asked quietly. "I'm saying we have to be cautious," Chad replied, voice now edged with defensiveness. "We've had situations before, fraud, money laundering. We can't take risks." "But you've never asked a white tech founder for his grandfather's land deed," he said. Not as an accusation, but as a fact. Silence on the line. Before Chad could respond, the pilot gently tapped his shoulder. "We need to start our descent," he murmured. "I'll call you back," he told Chad and ended the call. The rest of the flight passed in quiet. He didn't speak much. The pilot didn't press. When they landed, the pilot walked him to the hangar door and said, "You handled that like a pro. Most folks would have lost it up there." He just nodded. "Thanks." Back in his rental car, parked under a scraggly palm tree in the far corner of the lot, he finally let it out. A long, slow breath that carried with it frustration, anger, and something deeper, disappointment. Not just in them, but in the system that let this happen without blinking. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat at the small desk in his hotel room, laptop open, reviewing every email, every voicemail, every note he'd taken. He wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for clarity. And maybe, just maybe, a way to make sure no one else had to go through this. He called a lawyer he'd worked with years ago on a land dispute, a black attorney who'd grown up in a farming family herself. When he told her what happened, she didn't sigh or say not again. She said, "Send me everything. Every message. Every request they made of you that they wouldn't make of others." He did. And within 24 hours, she had a preliminary assessment. This wasn't just poor customer service. It was likely a violation of federal fair housing and business access laws, especially if they applied different standards based on race or perceived background. Private aviation dealerships weren't exempt from civil rights protections just because they sold million-dollar toys. But legal action wasn't his first instinct. He'd spent a lifetime solving problems with his hands, not lawsuits. Still, he couldn't unsee what had happened. Couldn't unhear the doubt in Chad's voice when he said cash. Couldn't forget the way the receptionist looked through him like he was a ghost. The emotional toll crept in slowly. He found himself replaying conversations, wondering if he'd said the wrong thing, dressed the wrong way, been too quiet or too direct. He knew better, knew this wasn't about him, but the mind doesn't always listen to logic when dignity's been questioned. One evening, after another long day of calls and document requests, he drove to a quiet overlook near the Everglades. No people, no noise, just water, sky, and the occasional cry of a heron. He sat on the hood of his car, boots resting on the bumper, and stared at the horizon. He thought about his great-grandfather, standing on that first 10 acres with nothing but a handshake and a dream. He thought about his father, working sunup to sundown through Jim Crow winters, never complaining, just planting. And he thought about the kids back home who looked up to him, not as a rich man, but as proof that you could stay rooted and still reach high. This jet wasn't vanity. It was strategy. It was time reclaimed. It was the next step in a journey that began long before he was born, and no one, not Chad, not the unspoken rules of an exclusive industry, not the weight of history, was going to make him feel ashamed for wanting to fly. Still, that night in the parking lot of the hangar, after the test flight and the call and the silence that followed, he'd felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. Not about his worth, but about whether the world would ever see it without squinting. He didn't cry. Men like him weren't raised to, but he sat in that pickup for a long time, engine off, windows down, letting the warm Florida air wash over him like a balm. And then he made a decision. He wouldn't walk away. But he wouldn't beg either. If they wouldn't sell him the jet with respect, he'd find someone who would. And if the system was broken, maybe, just maybe, he could help fix it, not with anger, but with action. Because the truth was, he didn't just want to buy a plane. He wanted to change the sky. He didn't expect anyone to notice. He'd kept the whole jet ordeal quiet. No social media rants, no dramatic phone calls to local news. He figured it was just another bump in the road, something to handle with patience and paperwork. But word travels faster than you think, especially when it's about fairness. It started with a text from an old contact, a woman who ran a logistics company out of Atlanta. She'd heard through a pilot friend about what happened down in Florida. "That's not just rude," she wrote. "That's systemic. And you're not alone." Then came an email from a retired airline captain, now teaching flight mechanics at a technical college in Alabama. "I've seen this play out for decades," he wrote. "They'll smile to your face and stall behind closed doors. But there are folks who operate differently. Let me connect you." Within days, his phone was lighting up, not with sales pitches, but with offers of help. A black-owned aircraft management firm in Texas sent over specs on a CJ-3 they'd just taken in trade. Same model, lower hours, meticulously maintained. A venture capitalist in North Carolina, who'd once been denied a private terminal access despite owning 3 jets, offered to co-sign or even facilitate the purchase through his network. And then there was the call that changed everything. It came late one evening, just as he was finishing up irrigation checks on the West Field. The voice on the other end was calm, steady, with the kind of authority that didn't need to shout. "I heard you're looking for a plane," the man said, "and more importantly, for people who won't treat you like you're out of place." He introduced himself as the founder of a quiet consortium, part investment group, part advocacy network, made up of black entrepreneurs, pilots, and engineers who'd all faced similar walls in aviation, real estate, finance. They didn't advertise, didn't hold press conferences. They just made sure their own got a fair shot. "We've got a CJ-3 available," the man said. "Owned by a retired crop duster from Arkansas, flew it himself for 10 years, kept logs like a librarian. It's clean, certified, and ready to go, no games. No extra paperwork just because of who you are." He listened, wary but hopeful. "What's the catch?" "No catch. Just respect. You show up as you are, farmer, businessman, man of your word, and we treat you like any other serious buyer. Because you are." They arranged to meet at a small airfield in South Carolina, far from the polished showrooms of Fort Lauderdale. No glass walls, no receptionists with judgmental eyes, just a hangar, a coffee thermos, and a man in a flannel shirt who shook his hand like they'd known each other for years. The jet sat under soft hangar lights, not gleaming for show, but cared for like a trusted tool. The owner, a wiry man in his 70s with sun-weathered skin and a slow southern drawl, walked him through every system, every repair, every oil change. He didn't talk about resale value or status. He talked about reliability, about how this plane had gotten him home through thunderstorms and how the autopilot saved his knees on long hauls. "You treat her right," the man said, patting the fuselage, "and she'll treat you right." The paperwork was straightforward. Proof of funds once. A standard bill of sale. No request for ancestral land deeds or 5 years of tax returns. No side glances when he stepped out of his pickup in boots. Just business conducted with dignity. As he signed the final documents, the founder of the consortium pulled him aside. "You know," he said, "this isn't just about you getting a plane. It's about changing who gets to be in these spaces. Every time someone like you walks in and refuses to be shrunken, it opens the door for the next person." He nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing, but what surprised him most wasn't just the ease of the transaction, it was the feeling that came with it. Not triumph, not even relief, just belonging. Like he hadn't just bought an aircraft but been welcomed into a brotherhood he didn't know existed. On the drive back to Georgia, he called his sister. "It's done," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment. "Then did they treat you right this time?" "Yes," he said. "Like I belonged." That night, instead of collapsing into bed, he sat on the porch again, same as the night he first dreamed of the jet. But this time, the air felt lighter. The stars seemed brighter, and for the first time in weeks, he let himself imagine the future. Not just flying to meetings, but bringing others with him. He reached out to the pilot who'd flown the test flight, the one who'd seen him at his lowest and still offered respect. "You still looking for sustainable cotton suppliers?" he asked. "I am," she said. "Good, because I've got an idea." Over the next few weeks, plans began to form, not just for using the jet, but for building something bigger. He met with the retired captain from Alabama, who connected him with a program at an HBCU that taught drone operation and aviation maintenance, but struggled for funding. He talked to the logistics CEO about creating internships for rural youth, kids who'd never seen the inside of a cockpit, but might one day design the next generation of aircraft. He also followed through on the legal side. With his attorney's help, he filed a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights, detailing the disparate treatment he'd received at the original dealership. He didn't ask for money, didn't demand headlines, just asked for an investigation, and for clearer guidelines so others wouldn't face the same hurdles. The response came faster than expected. The dealership, once so confident in their compliance protocols, suddenly became very cooperative. They issued a vague public statement about committing to inclusive practices and quietly settled the matter out of court. No admission of wrongdoing, but a clear message. They'd been watched, and they knew it. But none of that mattered as much as what came next. One Saturday morning, he drove to the local high school and met with a group of students in the agriculture and tech clubs. He didn't talk about jets or money. He talked about time, about how every hour saved meant more hours for family, for learning, for building something that lasts. Then he showed them drone footage of his fields, explained how GPS-guided planting worked, and mentioned, casually, that yes, he now flew his own plane to conferences. A boy in the back raised his hand. "Do you think someone like me could ever do that?" He looked at the kid, worn sneakers, nervous smile, eyes full of questions, and saw himself at that age. "Someone like you," he said. "You're exactly who I'm counting on." And in that moment, he realized the jet was never the destination. It was just the vehicle. The real flight, the one that mattered, was the one he was helping others prepare for. The morning he took his first solo flight as the owner of the jet, the sky was clear and calm. No drama, no fanfare, just a soft blue dome stretching endlessly above the Georgia pines. He'd done his pre-flight checks twice, walked around the aircraft like he'd seen pilots do in videos, and double-checked the fuel levels even though the mechanic had already signed off. This wasn't just a machine to him now. It was responsibility, trust, legacy. He taxied slowly, the engines humming a steady rhythm beneath him. As the wheels lifted off the tarmac and the ground fell away, he didn't feel the rush of victory people might expect. No fist pumping, no triumphant grin. Just a deep, quiet steadiness. The same feeling he got when the first green shoots broke through the soil after a long winter. This was growth. This was continuity. But the story didn't end in the cockpit. It never really does. Back on the ground, something had already begun to shift, not just for him, but for others who'd been watching from the sidelines, waiting to see if dignity could actually win. Within weeks of finalizing the purchase, he started getting calls from young people, some from his county, others from states he'd never visited, asking how he'd done it. Not just how he'd bought a jet, but how he'd kept his composure when they doubted him, how he'd turned humiliation into momentum. He didn't have a grand speech ready, just honesty. "I didn't do it alone," he'd tell them. "And you don't have to either." That honesty became action. He reached out to the HBCU in Alabama with the underfunded aviation program and offered to sponsor a summer workshop, covering travel, lodging, and materials for 20 students. The focus wasn't on luxury flying, but on practical skills: drone mapping for crop health, basic aircraft maintenance, logistics coordination for rural supply chains. He even flew down himself to teach a session on how modern farming and aviation intersect, how GPS-guided sprayers, weather drones, and efficient transport all rely on the same principles of precision and planning. One student, a young woman from a small town in Mississippi, stayed after class. "My granddaddy farmed too," she said, "but he lost the land in the 80s. I never thought I'd see someone like us up here." He looked at her, bright-eyed, determined, already wearing a flight cap 2 sizes too big, and saw the future he wanted to help build. "You're not just up here," he told her. "You belong here." Meanwhile, the complaint he'd filed with the Department of Transportation began to ripple through the industry. It wasn't a lawsuit screaming for attention. It was quiet, factual, and backed by documentation. But it was enough. The agency launched a review of sales practices at private aviation dealerships, focusing on whether certain buyers faced disproportionate scrutiny based on race, occupation, or appearance. Several firms quietly updated their internal policies. One even invited him to speak at a diversity training session, an offer he declined, but not before suggesting they bring in actual black pilots and entrepreneurs instead of using his story as a token. He wasn't interested in being a symbol. He wanted systems to change, not just stories to be told. Back home, he converted one of his old equipment barns into a learning center. On weekends, kids from the county came to build model drones, learn basic coding for agricultural sensors, and tour the jet when it was parked on the small airstrip he'd upgraded on his property. He didn't call it a youth program. He called it the hangar. And in that hangar, no one was ever made to feel like they didn't belong. The original dealership, the one with the glass walls and the skeptical glances, never reached out again. But months later, he saw their name in a trade magazine, announcing a new inclusive buyer initiative. He didn't smirk, didn't feel vindicated, just thought, better late than never. What surprised him most was how little the jet itself mattered once the real work began. Yes, it saved him time. Yes, it got him to meetings faster. But its true value wasn't in miles per hour. It was in what it represented. Proof that barriers could be broken, not with noise, but with persistence. Not with anger, but with action. One evening, as he sat with a group of teens in the hangar, helping them calibrate a drone's camera for soil analysis, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the pilot he'd met during the test flight, the one who'd seen him at his lowest and still treated him like a peer. She was starting a cargo co-op focused on sustainable goods, and she wanted to feature his cotton in their first shipment. "We'll fly it ourselves," she wrote. "No middlemen, just farmers and flyers." He smiled and typed back, "Let's do it." Later that night, he walked out to the airstrip. The jet sat under a blanket of stars, silent and still. He ran a hand along the wing, not with pride, but with purpose. This wasn't the end of a journey. It was a bridge, and bridges aren't built for one person to cross. They're built so others can follow. Years from now, when those kids from the hangar are flying their own planes or running drone networks over fields of their own, they might not remember the details of his story, but they'll know this. Someone who looked like them, who came from dirt and drought and doubt, refused to stay on the ground. He never set out to be a pioneer. He just wanted to do his work, honor his roots, and move through the world without having to prove his worth at every door. But sometimes, simply refusing to shrink, is the most revolutionary act of all. As he turned to walk back to the house, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the pecan trees his grandfather had planted. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, low and long like a promise carried on the rails. He took a deep breath, the scent of earth and jet fuel mixing in the night air, and smiled. The sky was open, and so was the future.